Hello. Today I'd like to talk to you about a tool that my colleague Dr. Johannes de la Fuente and I developed as a way for teachers to dive just a little bit deeper into the data that they're collecting. And what we're calling it is the Metacognitive Data Tracker. So if you had to guess, why might a student get a question wrong on an assessment? What would you say? What would be some of the reasons that a student might get a question wrong, a multiple choice question? Well, what we did is we did a lot of research. We looked around at scholarly articles, at websites. We asked a lot of our teachers and instructional coaches what they thought, and what we were able to boil it down to was these four options. A student will miss a multiple choice question, specifically on a science assessment, for one of these four reasons. Number one, they didn't understand the question. Number two, they didn't understand some of the vocabulary. Number three, the answer choices were confusing. Or number four, they weren't sure what the picture or graph was showing. Specifically in science here in the state of Texas, the assessments that they give in science have a lot of visuals, lots of pictures, lots of data tables, lots of graphs. Anywhere between 65 and 70% of the test has pictures. So we wanted to include that as one of our four options. So what we did is we piloted this data tracker with our fifth grade students who took a benchmark in January. We handpicked 7 teachers that were willing and able to basically ask the kids after they gave the assessment, why did you get this question wrong if they got it wrong? We used Google Forms and then in correspondence to the spreadsheets. I'll show you how to do that in a little bit. And in total, we collected over 4,000 pieces of data. So prediction time. Which one do you think the students identified the most as being the reason that they missed a question? Just think about that. Was it the question, the vocabulary, the answer choices, or the pictures/graph? Here's what our elementary data told us. I've kind of hidden the categories, but as you can see, the blue, red, and yellow are all pretty similar, around 30%. The blue is the biggest, but then there's that green piece that is definitely the smallest. So just take a second and think. What do you think it is? Which one of our four options do you think the students picked the least? Well, to our surprise, that green section is that they did not understand some of the vocabulary. The biggest piece was they did not understand the question with 33%, and then second place was the answer choices were confusing at 30%. So what our students are telling us is that when they take a multiple choice assessment, and if they get it wrong, most likely or most commonly, the reason they got it wrong was because they did not understand the question. And this was a little bit surprising to us. I can say from my experience, when I was in the classroom and I would get my data back, I would see which topics we did well on and which topics we struggled in. And in the topics that we struggled in, I would immediately go to vocabulary. I would pull out the flashcards and all those drill and kill worksheets. But what this data is telling us directly from the students is that the vocabulary isn't what's tripping them up. It's the question. And so we presented this after we piloted it with the elementary students to our middle schools. And our middle school teachers gave some pretty strong feedback saying there's no way vocabulary is that small. Middle school brains, they're a little bit more advanced. They'll know, and they're going to tell us it's the vocabulary because these kids don't know the vocabulary. And so we said, okay, that's fine. Go ahead and do this with your students. The 8th graders took a benchmark in February, and this is some of the data that we got back from the middle schools. Here's one middle school's data where you can see it's less than 3% of the students selected that the vocabulary is the reason they got the question wrong. At another middle school, you can see it's less than 6%, with almost 50% of the students who got a question wrong said it was because they didn't understand the question. And then another middle school that collected the very same data, that little red piece you can see, number that they said is number 2, I didn't understand some of the vocabulary. So what does this data tell us? Number 1, we need to develop our students in understanding what the question is asking. If we're not doing that, or if we're just plain avoiding that, then we're missing between 30 and 50% of the time when a student gets a question wrong. They're saying it's because they didn't understand what the question was. So if we're not developing that skill in our students, we're really missing the boat there. Next, we need to get the students thinking about how to choose their answer more carefully. The second most commonly picked reason for missing a question was that the answer choices were confusing. So are we teaching our students how to think through those multiple choices and pick really the best answer? And lastly, we need to spend less time on blanket vocabulary review. Yes, vocabulary is important. Yes, they do need to know all of these words, especially in science. There's so much scientific vocabulary that the students need to know. However, if that's all we're going to do during our reteach or during our small group instruction, then we're not helping the students in the ways that they need help. So let's look at how you can implement this with your campus and your students. Like I said, it's just a basic Google form. That's all we've really done. So this was our January benchmark. I inserted the question number. I also inserted the student expectations. These are the standards here in Texas for 5th grade. And then I did some branching scenarios. So they have to then say, did they get it correct? And if they say yes, then they submit the form. There's nothing else to do. If it says no, you can see it goes to section 4. Here's section 4. They have to put in why they got that question wrong. So we give them 30 seconds to think about each question and say, what is it about this question that really tripped me up? And then for the most part, they're done. There is one little variation. If they do select that it was vocabulary, we do have them go to one more section and just type in what was the word that tripped you up? What was the vocabulary word that you didn't know? And that's just more good data to collect. This is what the Google form looks like as a practice. So here the students would select, okay, it's question number 1. Let's say that the student expectation is 5.5a. Let's say they got it wrong. And it's because they weren't sure what the picture or graph was showing. So they hit next. As you can see, we have it set to automatically collect their email addresses. If your students have the single sign-in, it will automatically collect their email addresses. They don't have to type it in every single time they submit. But then they submit their response, and then it goes into a spreadsheet. This is the one that I just did. You can see it's got my email address. It was question number 1, 5.5a. I said no, and it was because of the picture or graph. So this is the spreadsheet that it will take all your responses and put into. As you can see, I've only put in a few practice items here. I've only got 5. But another cool thing that you can do is, I've already done this, is I took this column, and just by hitting that insert chart, I was able to create a pie graph. So as you can see from the data that I've collected so far, 40% of the responses were I didn't understand the question, and then it was even between the other 3. Now, the cool thing is when a teacher goes to a data meeting and there's a specific question that they really struggled with, you can actually filter all of this data. So I selected this top row and I hit, it says create a filter. And then if I click on question number, I can clear all of these checks and just select, let's just say it was number 1. Let's say we kind of did poorly on number 1. I can just filter out question number 1 and it will actually update my pie graph. And I can see, wow, 50% of the time the kids got it wrong. It was because they didn't understand the question. So I need to go back and look at number 1 and figure out, why didn't the kids understand what this question was asking? It's just a more specific and intentional way to look at your data and what your kids are telling you as to why they're missing these questions.